Yeah, good evening, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. My name is Michael Lang. I'm a Vice Rector for Research and Human Resources here at WU, and I'm happy to welcome all of you, those who are here in the room, and of course those who are sitting at home in their office, wherever, who are participating online. I want to congratulate you that despite the nice weather, you have decided to participate in this exciting event, and I think we all agree that the topic is really exciting. I think everybody is aware of the current climate crisis, and of course there are a lot of different events at WU and at other places about the climate crisis, but I think not many people are aware that the central banks can also be actors in that context, and that's exactly the topic of tonight. And I'm very happy that we have distinguished speakers, including the Vice Governor of the Austrian National Bank. And I want to thank also the Department of Strategy and Innovation, and in particular the students, the master students, of putting together the program and organizing this exciting event with the help of our unit Marketing and Communication. Yeah, having said that, I think you've all come in order to listen to exciting and interesting keynote speeches and to contribute or at least listen to the discussion afterwards, and therefore I'd like to hand over to Marianne Hug, who will guide us through the evening and introduce all the speakers. Again, many thanks to the department and to all of you who decided to show up for this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lang, and also a very warm welcome from my side. It's super nice to see you all here in the audience today, but also wherever you're sitting at home. My name is Marianne, and I will be your guide today through the evening, and I hope you will enjoy it with me, and I will for sure enjoy it with you guys. So just to give you a quick overview of what is coming tonight, we will have two nice keynotes. They will be short and sweet. They will just give a quick introduction and lay the foundation for the discussion later on. And then we will jump into the discussion where we will add two panelists and we will just discuss the today's biggest issues as WU Matters, WU Talks projects. But I don't want to bore you with myself. I'm not that interesting, so I will introduce the first keynote speaker to you right away. And we are very lucky to have him here today. It's Professor Dr. Gottfried Haber, the Vice Governor from the Austrian National Bank. But he's also an alumnus of WU, having studied economics and business here. So this is for sure a home turf opportunity for you as well. And therefore, he has expertise in numerous areas, not just economics, but also business, and also programming, so I've learned. He's also a professor for economics at the Donau University in Krems. And he will for sure give us some interesting insights in the green shift in central banking. And Mr. Haber, the stage is yours. And I hope you'll enjoy the discussion with him.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's, of course, a great pleasure for me, as you said. I have visited, well, not this house in the physical sense, but the old WU, which at that time was the new WU, and the very old one was at Franz Klein-Gasse, the Welthandel. It's great to be here. And of course, if we talk about the role of central banks in the context of energy transition, it's a great pleasure to be here as a member of the board of the Austrian National Bank and also alternate governor in the ECB Governing Council and the SSM supervisor, a member of the SSM Supervisory Board. So we in fact deal with those issues, and greening the let's say, at least financial economy, of course. When we talk about the role of central banks in the context of energy transition, well, let me first put a few remarks on that. Central banks have put emphasis and focus on greening financial markets and greening the economy, of course, because we talk about sustainability in the environmental sense. We talk about sustainability also in the economic sense, because if there is no environment, there is no economy. If there is no economy, there are no financial markets. So, of course, it's important. And as an institution, the European Central Bank has responsibility in those issues, of course. It's all about transition to sustainable generation and use of energy. So in fact, to be honest, when we talk about climate change, we talk about physical risk and transition risk. And from financial markets perspectives and the perspective of a central bank, of course, the main emphasis is on transition risk, because physical risk is not the type of risk we have to deal with as a central bank, as a financial market regulator, or as a monetary policy agent. So the focus, as I said, is on transition risk and, of course, on the impact on institutional goals of the ECB, on monetary policy transition and other issues. To be very clear about that, and that's the second part of the slide you're just watching, central banks are not the only game in town. So we have to be very careful when we talk about greening the economy and shifting the responsibility to just a single institution. Of course, nobody does that, but I'm still very inclined to talk about this because we should not overestimate the role of the European Central Bank or any other central bank in the world in greening finance and greening the economy. Why? Because, as most of you already have learned in some interesting lectures and seminars here at WU, you know, it's all about external effects. It's about internalizing those external effects, and that has to be done in the real economy. So, for example, let's say if banks are granting loans for investment, or if there is equity on the market which is redirected to some green or not green investment, it's all about the question, is there a view on true cost? Is there perfect information on cost, including environmental cost, including cost which might be incurred by not being sustainable? So it's very important to also say the ECB is not by primary law of the European Union in the position to define goals on green transition and energy transition. We have to follow the policy of the Commission. The primary target is price stability, and the secondary target of the ECB is to do any general policy measures, to implement policy measures which support the general policy of the European Commission, of the European Union, if they are not in conflict to price stability. So, to be more specific on that, what's the role that we can fill? It's about evaluating effects on our goals of price stability. And one of the most important things is, well, it's not against measures countering climate change. It's just to be honest about that. There is some issue which we call greenflation. And there is some upward pressure on prices if we engage in energy transition. Why? Because in the, let's say, core economic sense of the word, we would talk about effectiveness, efficiency, and productivity. And if we deliberately choose to follow a production technology which is not the optimal one in terms of cost effectiveness, but also takes into account sustainability issues. So if we choose another second best production technology because we care for the environment, because we care about sustainability, and I think that's the right way, but if we do that, that means that production cost would be higher. observing the ceteris paribus condition. And that means that, of course, there might be an upward shift, and calculations show that the energy transition might lead to inflation pressure for the next decade, which might be in the region of around 1 to 1.5 percentage points upward drift to inflation rates. So it's about evaluation, and it's about seeing what it implies and means for the primary target. It's about supervisory expectations and supervisory actions with respect to market participants. So what can we do there? Of course, micromanagement would not help for a central bank. What we can do is we can say, well, let's say 20 years ago, nobody cared about if there would be a risk of not being able to go skiing in Austria anymore. Nowadays, we know there might be lack of snow and climate change, global warming. So this type of risk has to be accounted within the risk management frameworks of banks, within the risk management frameworks of capital funds, and so on. So it's about information, it's about disclosure of information, and of course it's about enabling market participants to, as we economists tend to say, vote by feet. So to take the decision which takes into account environmental responsibility as well. What we also did is develop some tools for assessing environmental risks and to try to close data gaps. But as I said, I'm not convinced that there are any new instruments which would be needed. Mainly, it's all about including sustainability issues within the frameworks for risk management, for credit assessment, and so on, and being transparent on that. So it's a multidimensional approach we apply as central banks. It's taking part in international fora, it's being part of the NGFS, for example. It's about sharing best practices, it's leading by example. We will also start as a European system of central banks with disclosing environmental indicators during the next years. And of course, we are also some kind of company as an institution, so it's also about reducing the footprint, the carbon footprint of the central banks as well as institutions, as I said, companies. So what I think is the main task is that there are private sector opportunities, and it's about showing those opportunities, it's about providing information on that, and we see that there's a huge demand, or an increasing demand, to be honest, on sustainable investment funds also in Austria. So at the moment it's several billions of euro which we talk about. There are double-digit growth rates year on year, and you can see that the green bond issuance from 2015 to 2020, it's on that slide, is beyond $1 trillion. So if there is market demand, then we should do as central bankers everything which is in our powers and within the reach of our instruments to enable this, as I said, voting by feet and enabling market action. On the other hand, I would be very skeptical on, let's say, greening the monetary portfolio of central banks. There is also discussion about that. But we talked about this, we started talking about this a few years ago when we had expansionary monetary policy, where the ECB had net purchases in the purchasing programs, and that meant that preferring green investment could have an impact on facilitating investment in those areas. But in times where we see a normalization of monetary policy and more restrictive monetary policy, there might be some kind of de-greening if let's say in a hypothetical world, the proportion of green investment would be 100% of the portfolio, and if we reduce the portfolio, of course, that would be kind of de-greening. Of of course, we're not talking about that, and the primary target, of course, is to have price stability. So there are also non-monetary policy portfolios in central banks, and of course, there's a lot more opportunity to be green in those issues as well. In Austria, we had 170 billion euro investments, which we think would be required until 2030. And of course, that's a lot, and that's a huge task for financial markets to provide those euro values. And I think it's an opportunity for greening financial markets. And we see that demand for greening, for real greening, is high. So I talked about greenflation by now. Let me skip that and come to my final slide, because I'm very much looking forward to the next keynote and the discussion we want to have. So as a company, as an institution, ÖNB itself and also other central banks in the Euro system are committed to sustainability. We posed a pledge in 2021 as ÖNB and also the Financial Market Authority in the context of the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow to carry out the tasks as environmentally friendly as possible. But I know you're not interested in the very, very small part, a small institution. We are also, compared to the world, we are small, can contribute. I think our focus is on what can central banks do. And as I said, my hypothesis is it's less about monetary policy, it's less about greening the portfolios of the central banks. It's more for setting the correct framework, and it's more on facilitating market information and market transparency and enabling green finance by market agents. So let me stop here. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Well, thank you very much. I think that was an interesting foundation, and I'm already looking forward to the discussion later on. But to put things a bit more into context and to provide a broader overview, I would also like to introduce our second keynote speaker. We are very lucky to have him today as well, Dr. Georg von Föstl. He's also an alumnus from WU, so we're all like among friends here. He's holding a doctorate in banking and finance and also an MBA. But now he's a principal at Arthur D. Little, focusing on financial services, also on ESG and sustainable finance. So for sure, an expert for this topic. And yes, I would like to welcome you up to the stage, and the floor is yours.
So first of all, let me thank you for this nice introduction, and thank you also to the WU Matters, WU Talks team for inviting me. It's a great pleasure contributing to this green shift discussion. Let's say my starting point is the perception or the view that ESG in a broader sense and sustainability is an irreversible megatrend. So we cannot neglect it. It's simply the imperative for a new normal. We see growing public concern, we see climate risk increasing, we see an increasing pressure from different stakeholders, we see tighter regulation looking at supervisory and regulatory authorities, and what Mr. Haber mentioned, that ESG and climate risk is also playing into the credit decision in the underwriting and impacting the funding. Coming and looking to the title of this event, what I intend to do is just to spend the next 10 minutes with three hypotheses, and obviously afterwards in the discussion we can discuss it. My first one is ECB and the national competent authorities, and as Mr. Haber mentioned, in the role as central bank looking at the monetary policy, but also in the role of supervising the large institutions in the Eurozone, should contribute to the green shift as much as they can. Obviously within the mandate and to keep the full independence. So it's not so much a question if, and looking also at the title of the event, it's not so much a discussion should ECB, should ÖNB and other authorities support the transition. It's rather what they can do considering the mandate and, as mentioned, keeping the independence. We know that ECB is not an elected authority. We know that ECB has no democratic legitimacy to correct political actions or inactions. Nevertheless, we are talking about systemic risk, as Mr. Haber explained, in the monetary policy, but also in the risk. Hence, we should do whatever we can do to support it. Monetary policy, we know that ECB has a roadmap, among others, macroeconomic projections, simulation, scenario analysis. We all know about the collateral framework, which is under review to consider climate change. And we are also aware of the corporate sector purchase program. If we move, let's say, to the supervisory role of ECB, and myself coming more from, let's say, from the supervisory, from the risk management side, ECB clearly expressed her expectation on how financial institutions should deal with climate and environmental risk. And coming to the supervisory topic, and if I'm going back a couple of years, in the year 2014, I compared with a similar discussion with the creation of the banking union and the SSM, so the single supervisory mechanism as a core pillar of it, whether a central bank, ECB, should, in addition to the monetary policy, take the role of a supervisory authority. And I can remember at least, and happy to take this point afterwards in the panel, I know that many market participants had, let's say, it was quite strange to accept that ECB is taking over a supervisory role. Obviously, we had no time. Simply, we had no time to create a separate and new supervisory authority. And similar to the climate risk, we simply cannot afford to lose time. Probably one point Mr. Haber mentioned, because we are talking about ÖNB, we are talking about ECB, what is clear, and it was mentioned before, that ECB cannot solve the problem alone. So ECB or other authorities, they are one puzzle within a stakeholder framework, including stakeholders from both the financial and non-financial authorities. We have also colleagues here from NGOs, we have corporations, we have the science as well, and all need to play her or his role to contribute to make it a success, to realize the green transition. It's like an opera where there are different players and everyone needs to play his or her role, instrument. Obviously, which is important that everyone knows what role he or she is playing. And the second, they need to play his or her role well. And coming once again back, Mr. Haber, you mentioned as ÖNB or ECB, obviously the financial sector is a key stakeholder. On one of the slides, you had the number of investment needed to make this success happen. And that's why, let me come to the second hypothesis here. The financial sector, looking at mainly at banks, but also asset manager and insurance companies, can be the driver of the green change, given that we have the right incentives and obviously that institutions are coming, let's say, from walk to talk, meaning that they are implementing what they are communicating. So obviously, every industry needs to become greener, needs to become more sustainable. But considering, let's say, the role of financial institutions within the economy, within the broader society, it has a unique position, because it not only must change how it operates, new business models, including ESG, including climate risk in the business model, but also channeling the right investments, what we have seen on the capital, into the right project. So it's myself, let's say, coming from the banking side, it's quite interesting, because financial institutions have the possibility to simply reshape their perception, let's say, in the society, from being a part of the problem into leading the solutions. Obviously, this raises the question where financial institutions stand today. Obviously, we see a lot of commitments, but the majority of institutions see the green change or ESG still as a regulatory burden. They see it as a cost and not as an opportunity to create value out of it. Obviously, this needs to be changed. And the question is, what is required? Talking to many institutions, they are mentioning several things, and I would like to highlight one. They are asking, we need clear definitions, and we need market standards. Why? We all know that there's a lack of clarity at the moment, looking at the different terminologies, and we have a lack of available and reliable data. So this is what is, let's say, required, or banks ask from standard setter policy makers. The other point is, I mentioned there are a lot of communications going on. So if you follow, let's say, the banking sector, you are aware of the different communications and statements, net zero, and you have the different alliances and so on. But what is clear, that banks need to have ESG or the green topic as a key board priority. They need to come from talk to action, meaning they need to implement the measures they are communicating. Obviously, and currently we are discussing with several banks how they can implement it. Obviously, one key topic is ESG needs to be bonus relevant. So if you have a decision maker in a financial institutions, they have their KPIs, ESG needs to be incorporated in the incentive scheme. And they need to become a transformation partner of their clients. Lastly, there's also an ongoing discussion or a required shift from a short-term, return-oriented shareholder view into a more mid-long-term, value-oriented stakeholder mindset. And this leads me to the third hypothesis. We are discussing a lot of ECB and fully agree they should support whatever they can do. But in a long term, the key driver will not be the ECB or the ÖNB or any other. The key driver in a mid and long term will be the society, will be the clients, asking companies simply for new, for greener, for more sustainable products. If this will not be the case, we can make the frameworks, but if we as clients and also the next generation of buyers will not contribute, then we will not succeed with the green shift. What does it mean? Obviously, corporations, whether it's a non-financial company or also banks, insurance companies, they need to create or include ESG as a key element of their business strategy, of their business model. So it's not just an add-on, it needs to incorporate ESG. Obviously, this involves cost, it's an investment, but having the discussion whether we should go for ESG investments or looking at the financial performance. So it's not one of the both, no. Both are positively correlated. So companies with positive ESG programs will have a higher financial performance. And companies with weak ESG programs, they will simply disappear from the market or at least find it very difficult to getting finance and attracting customers as well as young talents. Will this pressure be strong enough this year, next year, in 2 years? Probably not. But we need not to take the world from today, but let's go 10 years into the future. How are you as young students, most of you, how are your shopping behavior in 10 years? Or my kids, how are they changing their shopping behavior? What are their expectations? And only if, as mentioned, only if this will happen, we can succeed. And one point we should be clear, so it's not that we can change immediately. If there would be an easy answer, all of us obviously would do is, I compare it, so if someone of you is practicing sport and run a marathon, it's like a marathon. And we are discussing quite a lot, and you might get the impression that we are quite advanced. No, we started the journey, but nevertheless we are in the first section of the marathon track with many kilometers and challenging kilometers ahead of us. Talking about clients and the society, what needs to be clear that it requires also a shift in mindset from ourselves. There are a lot of ESG projects which are blocked by neighbors, which are blocked by citizen initiatives. Why? Because they have a negative impact on certain, let's say, people. For example, if you have a solar park in your visual field, you might say, stop, I do not want to like it. It must be clear that every one of us need to contribute to the green shift, because simply if we cannot continue in the same way and expect other results. And with that, let me conclude it and taking, let's say, the discussion in the panel. Yes, ECB should do whatever they can, and considering its mandate, we need all of us, and we need not only to continue our measures, but we need to accelerate them just to have a bright future for the next generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, that concludes our keynote part of the event. And I would now like to invite all the panelists up to the stage, to join me on stage, in order to discuss what we need to do in order to run the next kilometers of the marathon. But first, I would like to lay the groundwork. If you want to get involved, I will ask every once in a while whether you have questions, and then you can raise these questions, and I hope that you do have questions. But also, if you're joining us online, you can also ask questions via the YouTube chat, and we will include them as possible. So now I would like to introduce our two panelists that are joining us additionally. First of all, Heike Lehner, who is a researcher at Agenda Austria and focusing on monetary economics and environmental economics. So exactly what we're discussing today, but also she's a doctoral candidate here at WU, also focusing on monetary economics, and she's doing some empirical work on inflation, which is obviously a very interesting topic at this moment, I suppose. So we're very happy to have you here today. And last but absolutely not least, Mark Beckmann, who is a master's student here at WU doing the SEEP Master, which is Socio-Ecological Economics and Policy, but he's also a researcher at Positive Money Europe, which is a not-for-profit organization that, quote, aims to make the money system support a fair, democratic, and sustainable economy. So just what we need today. And Mark, I introduced you last, but I would actually like to start the discussion with you today. Having heard the keynote speeches, or the keynote speech, would you agree, have you any points to add, but especially do you agree that transition risk is way more important and we don't need to focus too much on the physical risk?
Yeah, first, thanks so much for organizing this event, for inviting me, and I'm really pleased and honored to be here. I think what came through in both keynotes is that climate change is a responsibility for central banks. Central banks are legally required to consider climate change as part of their primary mandate, as part of their secondary objective. I was particularly pleased to hear the secondary objective mentioned, because I think it's often being forgotten. About the point on transition risks and physical risks, I'm not sure if I actually misunderstood this. I think kind of physical risks as climate change impacts definitely have impacts on price dynamics through extreme weather events. For example, just heated summers can raise food prices. So I think the empirical studies more and more coming out that physical risks also, in addition to transition risks, matter for inflation dynamics and hence for the price stability mandate. I think, yeah, I have several kind of thoughts about the keynotes. Maybe I just start with mentioning a few of them, and then you can go to the other panelists. Maybe one thing I want to pick out is this idea of greenflation. Greenflation as being seen, as I've heard this previously, as kind of the inflationary effects from the green transition. So because we are transitioning our energy sources, for example, that causes inflation, and hence kind of the transition is to blame. And to me, that is really misunderstanding the issue. To me, I would think that is fossilflation, not greenflation, because basically we see fossil energy prices being currently mostly causing the inflation that we're seeing today. And just because we've kind of failed in the past to internalize the externalities, the environmental effects of fossil fuels, and that we now have to kind of internalize these effects due to carbon pricing, I think that is no reason why that's now greenflation. I think it's still fossilflation. So just because we kind of failed to internalize these costs in the past, and because we failed to in time transition to renewable energies, I think that doesn't mean that now the transition is to blame. It's still, I think, fossil fuel dependency that's to blame. So in my mind, it's clearly fossilflation that we're currently seeing.
Ms. Lena, would you agree? Because if I may read a quote that I read from you, demographic change and green transition are two of the most important reasons why we have to say goodbye to low inflation rates in the next decades.
Well, I do agree that greenflation or fossilflation, or however you want to call it, is going to have an effect on low inflation rate in the next few years, maybe even decades. I also agree that you said that physical risks have an effect on inflation. You mentioned, well, natural disasters and all of that. Of course, it can increase food prices and have more effects. And maybe when I can also comment maybe on the keynotes, I'm a bit skeptical when it comes to the ECB actually supporting climate change how it wants to do now. If we look at the action plan that the ECB has put forward in the light of their strategic review last year, and we heard that before, that is thinking about maybe changing on how they buy corporate bonds and maybe shifting their focus from market neutrality to market efficiency, how they want to call it. I think that is most definitely a step too far. I think you can justify a lot when it comes to price stability and financial stability. William Nordhaus, the climate economist, held a presentation 2 years ago in front of the ECB where he said, of course, the ECB can support the transition, but they can also focus on other factors that influence inflation, for example, demographic changes or AI. But now, of course, okay, now we're doing climate change, that is fine, of course, but we really have to take a strong look also at potential costs and maybe downsides that this focus brings. Of course, independence is threatened. Of course, there is a high risk that the ECB comes under more political pressure, that it's politicized even more. And that my last point is that, of course, there's some attention that is diverted from fiscal policy, which is the main, which is basically the main policy that is responsible for fighting climate change, to monetary policy. And of course, if the ECB is not able to deliver on those, in my opinion, a bit exaggerated expectations, then of course that can lead in the longer run to a loss of reputation, loss of credibility maybe even, that in turn has an effect on its ability to actually deliver price stability in the long run.
I think you wanted to raise a point in
yeah,
rebuttal.
Thanks. Just, I think, maybe briefly on that notion of market neutrality, I think it's worthy to note that the notion of market neutrality is not in the treaties. In the treaties, it simply says an efficient allocation of resources. So that is also the basis for that shift from the principle of market neutrality to the principle of market efficiency. So I don't think the ECB is overstepping when it's moving away and considering alternatives to that principle. I think the ECB should be much quicker in figuring out an alternative benchmark that includes climate-related criteria. And also, I think the ECB is simply obligated on that second objective to support economic policies in the Union, which are clearly also by the European Parliament and by different institutions in the EU focused on the green transition, focused on climate neutrality. So if the ECB wouldn't support these, then I think, and kind of again supposing that this is not hampering its price stability actions, which I don't think it is, then I think it would be illegal if the ECB doesn't do it. So it actually, in my mind, the argument is flipped.
Mr. Haber, maybe you?
Well, to be honest, I tend to fully agree with what Ms. Lena said. I think it's, as I pointed out, it's in the secondary objective. But of course, in fact, in monetary portfolios, there is the issue of independence. And you have just one screw to turn, in fact. So if you have too many objectives, the system might be overdetermined, and that might lead to restrictions for the primary target. So I do not think that market neutrality is not implied by the treaty. In fact, I would also be very much in favor of market neutrality, especially in monetary policy portfolios. But central banks also hold non-monetary portfolios. And there is much more degree of freedom in those investments of central banks, of course. But in the core monetary portfolio, why not follow other targets and objectives as well? So it's, I have to admit, I have very much sympathy with the argument that, of course, sustainability is very important, but if we pretend that central banks can solve the problem, we lose the focus on where the real problem is. And the real problem is in, as you also said, internalizing external effects. And of course, there is the main role for fiscal policy, or even to be more specific on that, the main focus should be on real economy regulations, on emissions, on other procedures. So if we only focus on financial markets, and that's the regulatory aspect as well, then we just hit companies which depend on financing on financial markets. May it be equity or loans from banks. But there are several companies which can finance from profits they gain, especially in the brown economy, so it would not be the complete picture. And instead of implementing too many restrictions and rules on the financial agents, I think it would be more efficient, or it would be the main focus to focus on the source of sustainability issues, and that's direct regulations on production, that's real economy, market transparency, and so on. So I would also tend to be very careful on overestimating the role of central banks in this game.
Dr. von Försterle, I think you already said that in your keynote as well.
Yeah, probably just one comment on not discussing, let's say, primary or secondary objectives, but there was a short discussion on inflation and taking ESG, and we know we are talking here about green or the E, so climate and environment, but if we are talking about the S, the society, what does inflation mean? It simply destroys value on a daily basis. So take your bank account, we are destroying in real terms money on a daily basis. So inflation also from a ESG, from a sustainability, and Mr. Haber, you mentioned sustainability is also the economic sustainability. We need to simply, going forward, we destroy wealth of our society. So this is what my, let's say, I know that's not referring to the primary and secondary objective, but it's, let's say, this value sinking, we are destroying value, and to have a sustainable society, inflation obviously is let's say, damaging going forward.
Ms. Diener, so the green transition cannot happen without rising inflation?
Yeah, well, at least when we look at transitional risks, and if we look at carbon taxes, maybe broader regimes that we are seeing now in the next few decades, I'm pretty sure that we will have to deal with higher inflation. It's not only carbon taxes, but also how are they given back to the citizens. For example, like in Austria with the Klimabonus, how the money is given, how the revenue is actually well, given back to the citizens. I think that will also have a big role. And yes, I think that maybe not as high of an inflation that we're going to face in the next few decades than we have now, but I'm pretty sure that the ECB will rather have to tighten monetary policy in the next decades rather than expanding it. Well, I mean, the ECB has already kind of changed its inflation target to being a little bit more flexible. I'm expecting them to changing it maybe even further because climate change will lead to more volatile inflation or volatile output. So I'm also thinking that we're going to see a few shifts there as well.
Mr. Beckmann, you would like to add something?
Yeah, I think kind of the current price increases we're seeing, especially energy price increases, are a real problem, especially for the poor who have to shoulder these energy costs. But to me, a big part of that answer to how to deal with that now is to accelerate the green transition. Because as I said, it's not renewable energy prices, it's fossil fuel prices that are causing the energy price increase. And so actually accelerating the green transition, fostering energy efficiency would be a way to help also dampen the source of these price pressures. And I think beforehand it was mentioned in the keynote that there are no new tools needed. I think there are tools out there that could be adopted that allow the ECB to actually influence kind of and tackle the existing sources of inflationary pressures that don't just go on the demand side as kind of classical interest rate policy, but then that can really targetedly address the inflationary source pressures. And I think one proposal there is to green the refinancing operations, or to green the targeted long-term, the green shelters, the targeted long-term refinancing operations. And so what the ECB could do is to decide on a discount rate for green projects. So if banks significantly lend to, for example, clean energy or to energy efficiency renovations, then they can get a discounted interest rate when they want to refinance themselves at the ECB. That would be a concrete proposal, how the ECB can accelerate the green transition, how it can address the current cost of living crisis of many people, and also I think how it can ensure kind of ecological stability on the long term, which is a precondition for price stability. I think just today there has been an open letter by several NGO representatives, bankers, and academics that argue for such green dual rates, and I think it's really something to consider. Several ECB representatives have already looked into it. I think there are a few operational hurdles, but I think that would be a concrete example of what the ECB can do that I would like to hear more discussion about.
Would you agree that that's a feasible project or even viable?
No. I would be very careful about that, because what are the primary objectives of a central bank? First of all, price stability. The other, it's not defined as a primary objective, but the ECB is also responsible for banking supervision and financial market stability. And with a view to that, our primary goal, not to be technical talking about the primary objective in the treaty, the primary goal is that risk is priced correctly. So I would be very careful if there are any green supporting factors, any additional haircuts on brown parts of the portfolio, because it deviates from the very, very central issue that we should always have true risk depicted in all the operations. And look at the discussion on nuclear energy, for example. It's defined to be green. So if you apply a green supporting factor on that, you would emphasize investment in nuclear power plants. And I think that's not what at least parts of the society would like to have. So I think what the central bank and the supervisor, in that part I'm speaking as a supervisor, what we should look at is to have correct pricing and no mispricing of risk. And everything which deviates from that, and to be honest also the targeted long-term refinancing operations in times of tightening monetary policy won't play a central role anymore. So it's a second argument against focusing on the purchasing programs in times to come.
Yeah, I think it still plays a role even in kind of inflationary times, partly because the idea of dual rates is that you increase the deposit rate while kind of you can stand the interest rate by which banks can refinance themselves, can get money from the ECB differently. So I think you can still kind of increase the deposit rate while you allow banks to kind of cheaply fund themselves, especially for the green energy projects. And
but that would build up risk in the financial markets. It would be a threat to financial market stability if you just say the refinancing conditions depend on if it's green or not, because it's not risk sensitive.
I think to me, I definitely agree that the ECB needs to, of course, line all its operations with or like it needs to consider the risks that are out there. But climate risks, we talked about physical risks, we talked about transition risks, they're not adequately priced at the moment. They are definitely there, but they're not adequately priced. And that is, I think, if the ECB ignores that, if the ECB ignores the climate risks that are out there, then it's also not acting prudently. Then it's actually neglecting, I think, its financial stability mandate. I think it's neglecting its price stability mandate also.
Last short intervention on that, and then I'll be quiet. But that means for me, you have to correct the mispricing and not to compensate mispricing. And I think that was one of your arguments. If ECB compensates the mispricing by arbitrarily increasing interest rates for some banks or decreasing interest rates for some banks, then there might be a loss of focus on really correcting the mispricing in the market. So it's about correctly pricing the risk and not compensating it by not very effective measures of the ECB.
In my mind, if we don't take into account climate risks, then what we're doing is fostering these risks.
Yeah, but
if we're blindly kind of adopting the market neutrality principle and we're just shutting our eyes to the risks that are out there, then we are actively fostering the continued mispricing of risks. And that, I think, also exposes the ECB to increasing risks on its own balance sheet. I think something has to be done about the climate risks that are out there, and I think, in my mind, it's a minimum that the ECB aligns its operations according to climate-related risks, because it's, in a sense, just as any other financial risk. Financial risks can come from all many sources. The ECB has been doing that forever. So, of course, it also has to take into account climate-related risks.
I'm breaking my promise, just a short remark on that. Sorry. But I think the alternatives are not taking into account climate risk and mispricing, or having that done by the ECB, by the refinancing operations. I think there is a third alternative. It's correcting mispricing at the correct part of the economy. So it's about regulating that mispricing may not take place in the first place. And then you don't have to adjust haircuts or adjust refinancing conditions.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just last thing, maybe move on to something else. But like in my mind, that would be the central bank shrugging its head in the sand. It would be, we don't see any of these risks out there. We wait for somebody else to do it, and thereby it would kind of exacerbate these risks, and it would also make itself increasingly liable to these risks if it just kind of ignores that and pretends it's not there.
Maybe
please jump in.
I can just quickly jump in. I mean, you were talking about green telcos. I mean, I would be quite uncomfortable for, and the ECBs are unelected officials, to play green venture capitalists. I think that's more of like a place for fiscal policy to step in. If they want to subsidize some kind of green projects, then they should do that if they want to, but I don't think that that's a role for the ECB. And when it comes to pricing risks or taking into account risks, I think isn't that more of like a place for banking supervisions, which the ECB is already doing, and they're conducting climate stress tests. I mean, there's a lot of issues with that. I mean, conducting stress tests with scenarios over 3 decades or so. I mean, there's so many uncertainties. And I think there's also quite a lot of issue with the climate stress tests, also when it comes to data availability and all of that. But when it comes to green telcos, I'm not too sure that the ECB is unelected officials should actually do that.
Go right ahead.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, to me, it's kind of a false way of, or like a misguided way of thinking, to think that like doing something about climate change, that is the ECB taking active political decisions, and not doing so is then neutral and non-political. If the ECB doesn't consider climate change and doesn't align its operations accordingly, it's undermining climate policy. It's undermining the kind of the democratically elected priorities of economic policy, because currently the ECB has a carbon bias in its operations. When we look at the corporate sector purchase program, in that the ECB disproportionately buys assets from fossil fuel companies. So the ECB has already, it's making distributionally relevant decisions. So it's not the case that one is then kind of the ECB doing too much, and not doing anything is then kind of the neutral way of non-political decision making. I think that's a myth.
Just probably before, probably we move the next topic. As mentioned before, I'm coming from the risk side, and I mean, it's the task of banks to take risks. I mean, that's the natural business model of a bank, to take risks. So at the end, it comes, is this risk, what banks are taking, adequately considered, how they manage, how they price risks. So it does not say that now we have, that banks cannot finance a Brown or whatever a company. It's just to take into account the risk. The challenge is that as of now, we have a lack of data, there's a lack of data history, but that's the business model. They need to take risk, they need to lend, and to take it and to price it. And you mentioned this, the stress testing. We have this year also the thematic reviews. So it's, I mentioned before, it's the start of a journey. We all learn how climate-related risk, whether it's physical transition, we need to incorporate. But it's, if we say that the risk which is taken by financial institutions are adequately considered, are adequately priced, it's fine for the financial institutions, they take the risk, it's priced. It's most probably also fine for the supervisor authority, because there's no what's in the balance sheet of the bank, how the balance sheet of a bank might be impacted if a risk is materializing, but this is then covered. So I think we need to be careful. So it's a question if those risks, and we all do not know whether we are able to have the transparent picture as of now, but this is the key question, taking the risk and if it's adequately considered in pricing, provisioning, whatever. Full stop.
You just also mentioned the climate stress tests that were conducted, and I think we can jump a bit more into that topic. If I may quote from the ECB climate stress test that was conducted last year, I think, the results of the ECB's economy-wide stress test first show that there are clear benefits in acting early. Mr. Haber, are we acting early, and what does acting early imply in the ECB sense? It does not specify.
Well, it's hard for me to say we're, as a society, we're acting early, because for several years we have known that there are sustainability risks, and I would say as a society we are behind the curve on that. On the other hand, considering the climate risk environment and disclosure and climate stress tests, I think it's a process, as we heard in the keynote, it's about learning. So we do not know at that point in time what will be the final framework on that. And so it's a process of finding out which data has to be sourced, which KPIs would be important to follow. So I think what we are doing at the moment is, as a supervisor, we try to have banks fit and ready for that. So our focus is less on are they already implementing all of the tools which are not fixed yet, and the taxonomy and the framework is very new and not finished yet. So it's about, are they aware of climate change risk? And as I said, and perhaps it was a little bit misunderstandable, I think the main focus at the moment is on transitional risk. Of course, physical risk in the end is the most important part of environmental risk. But at the moment, I think that part of risk that is hugely underestimated is transitional risk, yeah, because we have to reconsider business models and risk associated with those business models. And that's the part we have to learn about now. At ÖNB, we also did a special climate stress test, and we simulated an increase in carbon prices, for example. And what we found out is there is still a lot to learn, even that we now know which parts of the economy will be hit and would it be a risk to the banking sector. And we see, well, we see differences in core capital ratios of the banks, so it will have an impact, but with a dimension that will be manageable. But also a dimension which is important to watch and to observe.
Any points to add to that?
Well, maybe. I mean, you were talking also about capital requirements and all of that, and you were also mentioning how the ECB still has a lot to learn, and there's a lot of uncertainties and all of that. And I'm I really hope that the ECB or as a banking supervisor will jump too fast and will actually require banks to hold much more capital and will act too fast on the little information it actually has. So I'm quite, I'm not so confident that the ECB won't do that, but yeah, hopefully they won't do that.
I would fully agree on that. So now it's the time to learn, to observe, to analyze, and not the time to link that to immediate action on capital add-ons or something like that. Of course, the discussion is led in Europe because there are also voices who would advocate for more immediate action and increasing capital requirements, but if the tools are not reliable, it wouldn't make any sense to use them for controlling or steering the system.
Mr. Beckmann, would you agree that this hesitant approach is the way to go?
No.
Surprise.
Yeah, I'm wondering. I mean, the longer you wait, the higher the risks will be, right? The longer we wait with doing anything, the higher in the risk language, climate risks will increase, and then also the adjustment will be more costly. So, to me, I guess I have a different logic of thinking about it. To me, there's a much higher cost and danger associated with acting late. And I also think, there's kind of sufficient data already there to at least do small steps. I think adopting a kind of precautionary approach, to me, is the right way of dealing with risks right now in regards to climate change. And I think there are actions that can already be taken, such as kind of excluding the most polluting firms from corporate asset purchases.
So before we have mentioned, I think, some issues with data availability, I think, from your side. Now you say we have enough data, so what's the discrepancy? How does that come? What data do we need, and
not
where
enough
does it
data,
get
but
from?
like I think sufficient data to not wait kind of 5 years until we do something. Right?
Okay. Would you agree?
Just one comment. Fully agree that we should not wait, but I have not the impression that we are waiting. So we are in the middle of starting of learning and taking action, considering obviously the downside, but we cannot overshoot. So this is my personal opinion, so fully agree we shouldn't wait, but I have not the impression that we are waiting. Second, regarding data, there are a lot of data, and we are all discussing what data do we need. Just one example, ESG ratings. Obviously, banks are relying on ratings, like the credit ratings. You know that there are ESG ratings as well. This is just one example about the reliability of one specific data. So if you look at, let's take the 5 largest ESG rating agencies, take the large Austrian banks and compare the ESG ratings of the large Austrian banks. They are completely, let's say, divergent. So it's not like with the credit rating. If you take Moody's, Standard & Poor's, Fitch, I assume the correlation is 90, 95, 99%. So in the end, it does not care whether you take Standard & Poor's, Moody's, or Fitch. For ESG ratings, you have a completely different setup. You have no market standard at all. So this is just one example. If you now are overshooting, take a ESG rating. Obviously, you can pick because you know, depending on the methodology and whatever, they are deviating. So this is just to be not overshooting, but obviously to start the discussion. And I have the impression we are, let's say, as mentioned before in the speech, started the journey, but it takes some time. So this is at least my view on the market.
So wouldn't a standardized ESG rating make sense? Or even only an environmental ranking that does not take into account social and governmental?
Well, actually, what we definitely need, and ESMA is also working on in building a kind of market standard. Obviously, they are private companies, but as mentioned, take the credit. There needs to be a kind of harmonization. Currently, there are different SKUs, methodology, some lack of data, some make some external based on questionnaire and whatever. So it's simply this. And anyway, the market pressure, once again, the market pressure will be strong enough to make harmonization to a certain extent of the ESG rating. Otherwise, ESG ratings will not be reliable data and simply will not be, let's say, play a role as it should be. So it's simply the market pressure. We are discussing a lot about ECB. Do not forget about the market pressure.
And let's not overestimate the value and the power of ESG ratings.
Absolutely.
Because they step in at the macro level. And if we want to correct market failure, we have to start at the micro level. So I know it's a very often cited and perhaps stupid example, at least in the discussion at the central banks. For example, if OMV engage into some financing operations for decarbonizing their product portfolio, this would be rated as a brown investment. But in fact, it would reduce the carbon footprint and would be beneficial in terms of sustainability. So if you step in at the macro level and at the level of the taxonomy, and you just say, if you belong to a certain industry, you are brown. If you belong to another industry, you are green. It doesn't hit, in fact, at the micro level of the market, what we want to do, incentivizing green investment by internalizing the mispricing and the external cost. So that's the reason why I think it would be perhaps a mistake to overrush, to rush into action, which just sets in at the macro level and on ratings which are not, from the methodological point of view, are finished and completed at the moment.
Ms. Lena, please go ahead.
Maybe quick. I mean, the entire topic of ESG ratings, I think there's a big problem also when it comes to greenwashing. There was a directive that took effect, I think, last March, and since then, until like January, there had been close to 2,000 funds which had been reclassified as green. And I think, I'm not sure, but I don't think that all of them are actually that green. So I think when it comes to ESG ratings, there's a big risk of greenwashing, and also not only greenwashing, but there's been a few studies that came out which showed that actually when it comes to the financial performance and the returns, they're actually not because those companies actually performed that well, but it was simply because of the huge inflow of money that actually helped generating those returns. Bloomberg called it bubble trouble, and I think I will agree with that issue.
Mr. Beckmann, you would like to add something, agree, disagree?
Yeah, like I would be scared to kind of, and I think it's dangerous to rely on private finance actors to come up with their own voluntary standards or kind of common methodologies for rating risks and assets and for including kind of environmental climate factors into the asset rating process. I think it is. I mean, I think if you invested kind of a bit and looked into what is actually classified as ESG, I think many of you probably know that you'd be surprised sometimes. And I think it's an ECB climate action roadmap actually that has been agreed upon to develop minimum standards for incorporating climate risks into credit ratings. And I think that is really important, and the ECB should kind of be quicker in developing these minimum standards.
So there should be a standardized methodology for these issues, yeah?
Yeah, I think I hope that we agree that taking into account climate risks is important because it's as any other financial risk. And so I think it only makes sense that the ECB develops the minimum standards for how to take these risks into account.
Sure. Dr. von Fröstel, maybe I can come back to you. You said in your keynote that we all have to act and there are so many actors and the central bank is not that important or not that crucial. But don't you agree or don't you think that there's a strong signaling potential there?
Absolutely. So I'm not saying that ECB and or national competent authority should not contribute. What I'm saying is that it's necessary but not sufficient. So it's not the key stakeholder, if you call it green or ESG ecosystem, it's not the key player to solve the ecological issue we have. That's my opinion, because as mentioned, we have so many stakeholders, and primarily it's, let's say, what the market, what we are doing. Let's take an example, and there's a company out there which is not taking care about ESG. what will we or the next generation of buyers do? They simply do not go to this company. They are not buying products or services from that company. What does it mean? That company is losing clients, are losing turnover, so it has a direct impact on the top and bottom line, so meaning on the financial performance of that company. So companies without having a strong ESG performance will not have the financial performance, and they will not survive. They will not be the winners. But it's not because ECB. And obviously, what does it mean? Less or a weaker financial performance is a higher risk if you as a bank granting them a loan. Obviously, because there's simply the financial performance, the financial health of the company is less. Coming back once again, this is the transmission channel. Looking at credit risk, obviously the bank need to consider. Does banks currently consider climate risk to the full extent? Probably not, because we are not aware, and then we need to deal with a long-term risk issue. What about in 10, 20 years, which we as a banker are simply not used in the past, looking at 1 year time horizon in the PD modeling and so on. But this is how this is connected. So obviously it comes from the market and then spill over, let's say, to the risk. And if this is priced correctly, okay. I mean, it takes time, obviously.
Mm-hmm. It's a process for sure, yeah. Any points to add?
I very much agree with that notion that the ECB's actions on climate are necessary but not sufficient. I think I very much sign up to that. I think the statement that we shouldn't overestimate or that the ECB can't solve climate change alone, I mean, that's of course also true, but I think it's also a straw man and nobody's making that argument. I think the ECB has an obligation to act. It has a legal obligation to take its mandate seriously, which in the context of price stability means taking climate risks seriously. In the context of financial stability means the same. Secondary objective, we talked about it, economic policy is targeted at climate neutrality, so the ECB must support that. And because that was also, I think, mentioned beforehand, that often it's being kind of raised that we shouldn't overestimate what the ECB can do, because otherwise we would kind of put too much burden on it and that could damage its independence, or that could kind of be a threat to independence. I would make the argument, again, that it could be the other way around. I think if the ECB neglects climate change, if it's being too hesitant, too reluctant, and thereby is actually undermining policy efforts, democratically legitimate policy efforts to achieve climate neutrality, I think it is losing societal support, and I think that is a bigger danger to independence.
I see some frowns there. Any rebuttals?
I think we don't have any issues with the ECB underestimating climate change at this moment. I think right now there's an actual danger that it's actually doing, well, I'm not saying too much, but it's actually neglecting its price stability objective a little bit. I mean, if we look at current inflation and the discussions on fiscal dominance in the past few months, I mean, to me, the danger is quite realistic that in a few years from now, we might have the issue of green dominance, I guess you could call it, which in turn might have a detrimental effect to its price stability objective.
Maybe this would be a good time to take some questions from the audience, if there are any. Sure, maybe you in the last row.
Thank you. I would have a question for Professor Haber regarding price stability, because we talked quite a lot about it, and inflation is currently peaking across Europe at around 8%. And at the same time, the ECB is still purchasing loads of government bonds and is keeping the rates quite stable instead of hiking it. So how does that go along and how does that fit?
Well, let me start with a short story. When I went to Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago to the IMF spring meeting, I had a very nice opportunity to have a talk with Jerome Powell. And in fact, he's a very lucky guy because his job is very easy in the United States. Because you have demand-side driven inflation, you have high economic growth, you have a low proportion of imported inflation by energy prices. There is a little bit, but not much. So every textbook would say what you have to do, just reduce purchase programs, increase main refinancing operations interest rates. In Europe, it's a little bit more difficult, of course, because we have the demand side development. We still had restrictions on the demand side by the COVID crisis. That's at the moment finished, but it's not finished for all time, of course. And then we had the supply side shock by the war in Ukraine. And 2/3 of the inflation is imported by energy prices. And of course, a central bank cannot counteract this part of inflation which is imported. On the other hand, if you put your feet on the brakes, the problem might be that you cut off economic growth in a situation where growth rates are under pressure by the current crisis. In the statements which have been given, for example, by our ÖNB governor, of course, you might heard and read a strong preference on acting swiftly, and that would also, of course, imply reducing or ending the net purchases in the purchase programs by end of the second quarter, by end of June, and implementing interest rate hikes. Today, he just published an interview where he talked about 3 interest rate hikes and also a first step which could be 0.5 percentage point. So I think the discussion at the moment that the central banks goes into that direction on ending the net purchases very soon, and then not too long after that, but a short time period after that, increasing the key interest rates. So I think most market participants would expect key interest rates being positive by the end of the year, and the decisions that will have to be made on that will take place next week in Amsterdam. So you're lucky and I'm lucky I'm allowed to talk about this because we have not entered the quiet period yet, and I think tomorrow would be too late to talk about that. But I think a central bank has to follow the price stability objective, and one part is implementing action which is really effective against the inflation rate, and I think that's needed. And the other part is the signaling part, and it's very important to give a strong signal that inflation in this dimension is not acceptable to the ECB, and everything which is possible will be done. So whatever it takes was a sentence said by Mario Draghi when we went into the other direction, and I think it's important to do whatever it takes also in that situation.
Thank you.
The second question over there.
I would have also a question to the central banker. I think you were agreed on that if we green the energy, we have to take into account inflation, right? I would have a question if you did some econometrical prediction regarding GDP growth. If we green our economy, what influence will it have on GDP? It will maybe slow down by 0.1, 0.2%. Did you make any econometric prediction? And if you can say in which program do you do this? We use, I think, in EDVIO program R. So thank you.
Well, the colleagues at the statistical department always tend to use R for such analysis, for assessing the impact of climate-related policy. As I said, we did some stress testing on carbon pricing. That's even more complicated because you have, on the one hand, the economic model, and then there is a stress testing model, and they have to be put together. So it's implemented on different platforms, and it's not easy. And to be honest about that, it's not the quality of forecasts. So we have to be very clear on that. It's scenario analysis. And what we, for example, did for the stress test on carbon pricing we had some baseline scenario, and then we implemented let's say, benchmark scenario with a moderate and timely increase. and an alternative scenario where we had a later increase, but even sharper increase in carbon pricing. And what all of these simulation runs show, and also the analysis at the ECB show, is very similar. If you're behind the curve, it's costly. And I think that's the only robust finding that we could tell you at the moment. As I said, for the banking industry, the capital requirements due to non-performing loans and credit risk increases might be in the dimension of, let's say, 1.5 percentage points of CET1 ratios. So you can say that GDP impact for moderate carbon pricing would be below 1% of GDP in those scenarios we observed. But what we see now is hugely higher increases in energy prices than we talked about when simulating the carbon pricing, of course, and that's a threat to GDP. So if we have scenario analysis on import stops on gas, for example, for Austria, we are talking about differences in GDP by, compared to the baseline scenario, let's say 6-7 percentage points. So we could arrive at zero growth or even in negative territories as well, depending on the increase in energy prices and the impact of gas.
Interesting times for sure. Yeah, Florian over there.
So, because you just mentioned the possibility of the importing gas, if that would stop the GDP reducing that much, that's a massive risk, which was probably to some degree foreseeable, right? And isn't it then that's more going to the direction that more has to be done quicker, because this problem will not go away? If we don't, as Mr. Beckmann mentioned, green, and you said, I think the prices, the risks are not correctly priced in, if I'm remembering correctly. Whose responsibility is it that these risks are correctly priced? Is it the market? Is there a regulatory responsibility, or can also the ECB question more how the risks are priced?
Well, it's not an easy answer, because the ECB sets the framework. So there is a framework for risk management and how to include and price risk. Banks apply, the bigger banks imply internal models on that risk pricing. And of course, there is a validation of the models by the supervisors on the microprudential levels. So bank models are closely inspected by the supervisors regularly on if there is any mispricing in LGDs, in PDs, and other parameters, of course. So I would say there is no additional action needed by the SSM. In fact, it's the SSM part of the ECB, because there is also a regulatory framework in place obliging you to include risk as good as you can. Yeah? So to be honest, it's the main responsibility of the market participants to do that correctly, and it's the responsibility of the SSM and banking supervision to ensure that this is done correctly on a micro level and not on the macro level.
Any more questions?
But perhaps there's some agreement or disagreement by the colleagues here.
I fully agree. So it's the task of
you're the risk manager.
I mentioned before that obviously it's the task of banking to take risk. Obviously, then the banks have the responsibility to manage, to measure, to monitor risk. We have the framework, Ms. Haber, you mentioned, so no need. We have ECB with published some clear expectations on how to incorporate climate-related risk. We need to be careful. Climate risk is not a new risk type per se. So that's why talking about capital add-ons and Pillar 1 or Pillar 2 requirements, it's not that we are adding climate risk as an additional risk type. It's simply there are climate-related risk drivers, and the task of the banks and on the supervisory regulatory side, if you're looking at EBA, they need to ensure that the risk drivers coming from climate risk are incorporated in credit risk, market risk, liquidity risk, reputational risk, and some other risk. Just to keep this in mind, because you're often hearing, okay, now we have a new risk type. No, we have drivers, and this is how is climate change impacting, for example, if you are a bank, you are specializing in corporate real estate lending, how does climate change, physical and transitional risk, impact your credit portfolio, for example? You might simulate, you take your assets, real estates, corporate real estates, how is climate change impacting the value of your assets? You can assume when they are, let's say, near the coast and the climate risk and the sea level is rising, obviously this might impact the value of your bank. And then the transition risk, if you're saying you have an old building, wherever, in the city of Paris, which is very nice, but from an energy point of view, not efficient. What does it mean if there are new taxes coming in or whatever, impacting the cost you need to take care of this building? It simply reduces the value of your asset. You can simulate it via LGD. So you have it in asset LGD, then it goes to LTV, whatever, and then you are in the middle of the bank steering. But this needs to be done by the institution and then obviously supervised. So whether it's ECB as supervisory authority, whether it's EBA as regulator, they will never and they should not take the task of assessing the risk of a single bank having in the book. Full stop.
Hi. I like the notion that one of the most powerful tools is actually when we consumers make our decisions right, because then we tackle them on the top and the bottom of their sheets, their financial statements, right? But now we as consumers, for example, get into the problem that the whole topic about sustainability is on a hype train, and there is no perfect information out there. So every company out there nowadays labels itself in some way as sustainable, no matter if it really is or not. And then last week there was a post on the Financial Times. It was called "The War on Woke Capitalism," and it started with the speech from Stuart Kirk. He is one of the head asset managers of HSBC, and he basically said that, I'm looking for the quote right now, he said that he rubbished the consensus that investors should try to encourage a more environmentally responsible capitalism by factoring climate risks into their calculations. Climate change, he declared, was simply not a financial risk that we need to worry about. He was suspended for that statement. But then more and more voices came out. Tariq Fancy from BlackRock Investments said that he calls sustainable investing as a dangerous placebo, and Desiree Fixler, former head of ESG for the Deutsche Bank-backed asset manager DWS, says the acronym has become meaningless. So my question now to you is, for us as consumers, as researchers, as employees and employers, how should we look into the future of ESG? What needs to be done about ESG ratings? And what could we do now to not make some miles in this marathon in the wrong direction?
I'm happy to take this question, then please comment on your side. So first of all, what we definitely need, and this is no secret, and we all agree, we need more transparency about the ESG, about the sustainability status of companies. Greening washing was mentioned, but there's also the competency washing, so meaning that companies are saying I'm more advanced in the ESG implementation than I'm actually have. So this transparency with the clear definitions, Ms. Haber, you mentioned the taxonomy, which is currently just started focusing on 2 of the 6 objectives of the E. Then there's the S, the social, which might become. So we are starting, we are in the start of the process. So transparency, fully agree with you. It's a long journey, fully agree. But let's take the example what I mentioned before with the customer. Let's just think hypothetical scenario. Take a company, Brown, let's assume it's a Brown company, and all the clients are saying, I don't care, I go to this company and I'm buying the goods, I'm buying the services from that company. Let's just assuming in this concrete case, ECB, what should ECB, for example, do? The company, they are making profit, they can take the profit they earn, they do not need any funding, they do need nothing. So if this company, Brown company, would simply be healthy. Why? They have a lot of customers, they have profit, they can even increase the profit. It's all of us as clients are going to this company. Then, I mean, the company X would say, I don't care about ESG. This will not happen if we are not able to make this shift in our mindset. We are anyway lost in this green or sustainable shift. So we can, coming back, ECB can support, the National Competent Authority can support, but if we are not changing our behavior, then we are anyway, then we can say, okay, we are, let's say, lost in the green shift. So this is my view, but obviously, and just one comment, allow me sometimes. If I'm talking to my kids and they are, let's say, not now, already in the let's say, buying power, but they will enter the market, let's say, in 5, 6, 10 years, they will definitely have a different buying behavior than myself because they are learning in the school what is Nachhaltigkeit. So they are growing up with, let's say, with another environment. So it's similar to the digital topic. You are digital natives. I grew up and without mobile phones. So I know that's hard to imagine, but I grew up and even without a smartphone. So just an example. And the youngest from us, he's waking up at 6 a.m. and is going to the TV and is moving around. But just an example, the same is for ESG, probably not so pronounced compared to ESG, but we will come into that direction. If not, then there will be a gloomy future.
Maybe I can step in quick. I read the article and I think that we are currently relying too much on the regulators when it comes to ESG. If you look at the different directives and also if you look at the taxonomy, the regulations are sometimes vague, sometimes they're too complex, sometimes there have not been published any regulatory technical standards yet, sometimes they contradict each other, and it's a bit chaotic, I'd say, at the moment. And especially when it comes to ESG, when we look at the EU taxonomy, I think we should take a step back and also take a look at those directives. Take a look at the EU taxonomy. I think you mentioned nuclear energy. For some people that's green, for some people that's not. I don't think that we should rely on regulators telling us, okay, that's sustainable and that's not, but rather if you want to invest, for instance, in ESG, but really take a look on what's green for you. I know that might take a little bit more time, and I think we definitely need more transparency when it comes to that, but I think we should also question what the regulators should actually do and what they shouldn't.
So that would imply we just need more information, more transparency, and the problem solves itself, because we are all much more aware than former generations?
I mean, obviously, but I mentioned the transparency and the taxonomy was mentioned, but looking at banks, they have the Pillar 3 disclosure. We have the non-financial reporting directive now, obviously then coming back to the corporate sustainability reporting directive. That means we are working on increasing the transparency. It will take a couple of years. Obviously, now, if you're starting with a new topic and you are publishing something, also the expectations by the recipient, like you mentioned, you as a client, you are not aware if a bank or if a company is green or is not green. Obviously, also the expectation of the clients are increasing. So there will be this pressure to increase the transparency. Not this year, not next year, but this will be let's say, the way we will see over the next years.
Mm-hmm. Any points to add? Or are there any more questions in the audience? Maybe a last one, yeah? Go ahead.
I have a question to Mr. I think von Fürstl. I'm sorry. You mentioned in your keynote that two hypotheses you mentioned that are that first it's consumer driven, like one solution can be that's consumer driven, and the second one is ESG. So to the consumer driven approach, I'm a student of economics, so my critique would be the three wider problems. So the private cost of climate change is smaller than the social cost, so people naturally won't do enough. So how do you respond to that? Because I think that, especially looking at a global view, not enough will be done just from this approach alone. And secondly, ESG, you know, it comes down to being slightly cheaper for green companies to finance their operations, and I think in the long term, that's not going to be enough. And my question is, you mentioned that we are in the beginning of the journey, so how does the journey continue, and what else needs to be done in your opinion? Because you didn't mention internalizing the cost of greenhouse emissions, so what else, what else will be the way how we can reach the destination?
Yeah. So first, it's a valid point. So if we are going out and to ask a customer whether they would change, let's say, taking from a bank, whether they would go from brown bank to a green bank, they would say obviously yes. If you are asking, would you go into ESG or green investment products as a retail client, you would say obviously yes. If you say, but what about the return, risk-return pattern, then it's a different question. And the different question is whether you are stating, I will do it, and actually you will do it. So coming back once again, we need to see these actions from the clients. If all of us would say, yeah, it's really great, but I'm not doing it, I'm not caring, but all the others are doing, then we are in this situation, as I mentioned before, this will not solve the issue. Is the issue big enough? Then we take the actions. Obviously, it could take some time, because many of us in this room, for example, we might say, yeah, it's important, but nevertheless, I do not change my behavior. If this will sustain, then why should a brown company change behavior? Because from a CEO point of view, I have my KPIs. They are saying, okay, number of customer, great, great, achieve, I have profit, I can have a sustainable, from an economic point of view, business model. Unless this will, let's say, not change, then there's no let's say, no solution. Fully agree.
Maybe one last question, if there is another one. Okay. Any concluding statements? Any points you still want to raise and haven't raised yet?
Paul, if I may, just a short one, because we discussed a lot inflation and ECB. It seems that it's too gloomy a picture. We know there's a lot of investment, but also this green or sustainable transition gives a lot of opportunities. So if you compare it with the digital shift, now taking the green shift, there will be also a lot of opportunities, new areas where there are new skill set required, new technologies. So it's also an opportunity, let's say, for the market, for the society in going forward. Just to have not, let's say, going out and say it's all gloomy and it's all not working, the risk is not adequately priced and so on. It's also an opportunity for us, not only from the single company or institution, but for us as a society, like as mentioned, similar to the digital shift. Obviously, for the younger here in the room, it's obvious. But there was a time before the digital shift, and probably the next generation is saying it's obvious that we are having ESG, and we do not need to explicitly discuss about ESG because it's obvious that it's here. Like it's obvious that all of us now have a smartphone. Going back, Nick, and I think this is also some positive, let's say, message going out this room.
Maybe also regarding the last question, I think we could require the ECB to do all of it, but unless we're having some kind of carbon tax as global as possible, an expansion of the emissions trading system and all of that, we won't be able to fight climate change anyway. So there can be as many standardized ESG ratings as we want. The ECB could print as much money as they want and finance all the green bonds out there, it won't be enough, and it won't for sure not be the most efficient way to actually fight climate change.
Agree. I think we very much need carbon pricing, we need fiscal policy, we need green industrial policy, I think, a lot. And I think that is not in contradiction to saying that climate and environmental change is, in Lagarde's word, mission critical. I think if the ECB wouldn't take these into account, it would fail to seriously live up to its mandate. And maybe in kind of the spirit of concluding food for thoughts statements, what I think is interesting to consider and ask oneself is looking to the future with increasing climate shocks, with supply shocks that would raise the volatility of prices, that will raise prices whenever kind of an extreme weather event hits. I would pose the question to what extent our existing macro financial framework is up to that task. I think it is kind of sensible to think in a radically changed reality of climate and environmental crisis, what would an update of that macro financial framework look like? Frameworks and kind of mandates have always changed in history, and I think there are many reasons why one could say that the framework we currently have is not suited for such future. Because currently we are kind of delegating the pace and nature of decarbonization to private finance, and currently we are in a framework where whenever there are climate or transition-related price increases, the ECB will be pressured to raise interest rates to respond to them, knowing quite well that standard interest rate policies tackle the demand side and can't well deal with these supply side shocks. And also thereby kind of by raising the interest rates, not only using a tool that doesn't well tackle the problem, but also risking to sacrifice any progress we make in the green transition on kind of the notion that the ECB is solely responsible for inflation and hence has to raise interest rates to tackle these inflationary pressures. So that big question, I think that is really worth it to think about in the future. And otherwise, I think there are many things the ECB is obligated and can do at the moment, knowing fully well that it can't do everything and that fiscal and industrial policy plays a big part. But I think there's no reason to not advance the actions that are on the table for the ECB.
And maybe concluding the panel?
Well, as we have discussed that very extensively and the different arguments, perhaps a more general remark at the end. I very much like the notion and the idea of we have to act. In fact, I think not only the ECB or the SSM or EBA in monetary policy, in supervision, in regulation are responsible for setting a framework with as perfect information as possible. That also applies to other parts of the market as well. So I think what is really important is, as a society, we know that sustainability and climate change is an issue. So what we should do is to provide in every parts and every segments of the market as much and as accurate information as possible. That's the first part. And that's also a part that we can do as EBA, as SSM, and as ECB. But the most important part is that we have to act. So we have to use that information. We have to act according to that information. And so I would also like to emphasize the importance of everybody voting by feet. That means to buy products from companies which are environmentally and in other respects responsible. And it also means that sometimes it may be hard for us. So sometimes when I listen to the discussion on, for example, energy prices, of course, the first reaction is that if energy prices rise sharply by the crisis, then everybody wants to be compensated for everything. And then we talk about that, well, the commuters, they are hit very seriously because they have to spend so much of their income on energy. But if we talk honestly about that, it means that we would refrain from investing in brown activity. It means that we would refrain from consuming brown products. And it would also mean that we have to change the way of living in some perspective. And if energy prices are high, that's an incentive to move somewhere else and not to commute every day for 2 or 3 hours by car. So I think we have to be aware that energy change, that climate change counteraction, and that everything we talk about sustainability will only take place if we know that it might be harmful, it might hurt ourselves as well, and that some uncomfortable decisions have to be taken by ourselves. And it's not an easy part. But we had beautiful weather at the starting of that talk, and it shows that opportunity costs for you were very high to participate, and you are ready to take the challenge and to change your behavior. So I'm very confident that everything will be fine for the next generations.
I also think that's a beautiful last statement, and I think we have received a lot of food for thought, and let's go home and change our behavior, and we will make this green shift happen. And
go home and not drive by car.
Yeah, or take the U-Bahn, it's cheap as well. But yeah, thank you to all of the panelists for this super nice discussion, and yeah, I hope to see you again at other WU Matters events.
Thank you.
Thank you.